Hello and welcome back to the channel. So in this beginner friendly tutorial, we are going to look at how to build an advice generator app from scratch. So what this app is basically going to be doing is we have this button over here, and when you tap on it, we make an API call to a certain endpoint, and that API call is going to bring us a random advice, and we are going to show it on our screen. So basically that's all that the project is about. In order not to waste time, let's get right into it. So I have a new Flutter project app here. It's just a material app that's returning a home page, and this home page widget has nothing but a scaffold and then an app bar, right? So I'm going to run the project so that we start from there. So let's run this project. Okay, so our app is done building, and I will close the terminal so that we can have more space here. So the first thing we'll be working on is the app bar. We want to have a title for the app bar. So within the app bar, you can use the title property and then set it to a text widget, and this could be any title you want to give to the project. So I'm going to write advise me, right? And when we save, we should see the advise me shown at the top here. Now that will be all for the app bar, and the next thing I would want us to work on is the button we saw here, right? So that is going to be in a floating action button, and this is going to be the extended version of the floating action button. So floating action button dot extended, right? And the extended version of the floating action button gives you the ability to add a label to the icon. So the label is going to be a text that will say generate advice. So if I could spell generate right. Yeah. So when we save, we should have our floating action button to the right of our screen, the normal position. But we want to center it, so we could use floating action button location and set the location to center float. So this will put our floating action button in the middle. Also, let's add the icon that is to the left. So we can use the icon property and then set it to an icon. So icons dot grid and then 3 by 3. So that's the icon I used for the generate advice. What we have left is the card in the center of the body. So we are first going to have our body, and then the child is going to be a center widget, and the reason is we want to center everything in the body, which is just the card. So the child is going to be a card widget, right? And when we save, we are not going to see anything because the card has no content. But then the first thing we would want to do is to prevent the card from touching the edges of the screen. So in order to prevent that, you just wrap the card in the padding widget and give it a padding all around of 15. So I think that will be okay. And now let's add const so that we get rid of this warnings. Right, now within our card, we are going to have a column, right? So our child is going to be a column, and now that's also going to have children. Now within that column, we want to have another icon on the left here, a text in the middle, and then an icon to the right. So the best widget to align these widgets is a row widget. So I'm going to use a row widget within the column, and then the children of the row widgets, first one is going to be an icon, and the icon we are going to use is going to be icons dot format quote, so icons dot format quote, and that's going to give us this icon over here. And we just realized that we have a problem where the card is expanding to fill out the whole page, and we can solve that by setting the main axis size of the column to main axis size dot min, which means that only take the minimum size of your children, right? So don't expand to the full available space. Just expand, be as big as your children. So one issue we have again is that there is no padding within the card itself. Despite that we have padding around the center widget, that's preventing the card from touching the edges of the screen. There is no padding within the card itself. So the best thing is to wrap this column in a padding widget and give it a padding of 15, right? So I think 15 should be good. Or if 15 is too huge, you can use 12. Just any pattern that works, right? So we have this, and now within the children of the row, so we are going to duplicate this once more, and then we are going to have 2 of this, and then we are going to have our text in the middle. So text, and that is going to be the advice ID, right? So, and for now I'm going to write advice 1. So let's style this text, and we are going to use a text style from our theme. So we can access that with the theme.offContext property and then text theme. So that's going to give us a text style from our text theme. And if we don't have any text theme configured, we are going to use the default material text theme that comes with Flutter. So I'm going to use the title medium text style, right? And because I'm using something from my text theme, I can't put const here in order to fix that, right? And what we do again is we want to change the color of this particular text, the advice one. So we can copy that, whatever we have in our title theme or our title medium text style, and then change the color. And the color I want to use is my secondary color in my theme, right? So if we come to the main.dat, I have a secondary color which is just cyan. So you can either hard code the cyan here, colors.cyan like this, and that's going to work. But then I want to use it for my theme so that if I change the secondary color across the entire app, that's going to change as well. So we can also do the same thing, theme.offContext.colorScheme.secondary, and that's going to basically give me the same color, right? Now I'm going to space these out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap the text in a widget called expanded. So expanded, and then also center the text. So there are so many ways you can do this. You can use a spacer widget, or you could just use main axis alignment. There are so many ways you can do it, but there is just one way that you can do that. So I'm going to teach you guys another way you can also center this. So in the expanded, we can give the text over here alignment of center. So text align dot center, and that is going to center the text, right? If you don't want it this way, another way would be to, let me undo everything, is to use the main axis alignment and set it to main axis alignment, the space between, and that's going to do the exact same thing. So just choose which one you prefer. For now I'm going to go with the main axis alignment because that is much simpler, and then add my const. So that will be for the top section of our card, and then the bottom section is just going to be the text, right? So let's first collapse this row, and after the row we want to have some space before the text. So what you could do is you can wrap this row in a padding widget. So wrap in a padding and give it a padding of only bottom, and I'm going to give it 15. I think 15 will look good, right? So it means I'm having a padding of 15 here, and then now we can finally collapse this for now and work on the text itself. So the text will be just, so for now the text is going to be press the button to generate advice. So that's going to be our initial text, right? This is the initial text, and let's style this a bit. So style, and then we are going to use a text style that's not around because it's just going to be a simple styling. So we want to just increase the font size to 16, right? And then center align this text. So if the text that we get is maybe lengthy, right, maybe 100 words, we want to center it. So outside the text style, we can use the text align property and text align everything to the center, right? So this is all that it takes for the UI, and then we are done with our UI. So the next thing is getting the actual advice from the API, and we are going to use an API called advice slip, right? So you can just go to a browser and then search for advice slip, right? So api.adviceslip.com, and this is the API we'll be using for the random advice, and they have the URL over here, which is adviceslip.com/advice. So if you tap on this, you realize this is going to be the response you will get when you make a request to this URL. So just api.adviceslip.com/advice, and each time I refresh, I'm going to get a random advice with an ID, right? So let's copy this URL, and under the state, we are going to create a function that will call this API each time that we press this button, right? So let's have a function. So future, it's not going to return us anything, so void, and then fetch advice. So we could call it like this, and that's going to be an asynchronous function. Now the question is, how do we fetch this advice? So there are packages you could use to make API calls in Flutter, and in this project I'm going to use the Dio package. So go to your pubspec.yaml, and then just under the dependencies, add the Dio package. So add the latest version of the Dio package, and then run flutter pub-get. So that should give you the latest Dio package, right? Now you can close the pubspec.yaml file, and I want to make an API request to this URL, the endpoint we just copied. Because this is an asynchronous function that can result in an error, I want to wrap everything in the try catch. So try, and then catch. Alright, so this is going to be our try catch, and our API call is going to be in the try block, right? So let's first create a variable for the response that we'll be getting. So final response equal to await dio.get, right? And then we pass in our URL. So the URL is https api.adviceslip.com/advice, right? Now when we get this particular response, we want to check if the status code on the response is 200. So 200 means whatever request we made was successful, and then we got some data. So if response dot status code equal to 200, then it means our request was successful, and then we can safely retrieve our data. So let's create a variable for the data, which is going to be our response.data, right? And for now, let's print this data and see what we are getting. So print data, right? And then if there's an error, we're going to just print the error for now. Let's open our terminal to see what we have. So in order to call this, I'm going to copy the fetch advice and then put it on the press like this. So when we click on the button, that is going to call the fetch advice. So when I tap on generate advice and realize that we have some results. So the results contains a map with a key slip and then some data, which is also a map form, right? So there is not just a map. The type of this is a string. So we have to decode this into a map. And in order to do that, we can decode the whole response data, right? So the data that is coming from this response. So we can use JSON decode, which is a method in Dart, to decode our response. And then that's going to be response.data. And since we realize we have a slip property in the object, which is now going to be the map we are going to get from this JSON decode, we can access the slip directly from here, right? So it means when you turn this response data into a JSON, which is a map, right? So in this case, which is going to be a map, so we have a JSON string, and that is going to give us a map. If you successfully convert it to this form, we want the slip property on it. So the slip property just give me the value associated with the slip property, right? So if we print the data again, and we're already doing that, so if we print the data again and then tap on the button, realize we have ID and then advice, right? Because we are just taking out the slip. Now if we take away the slip and then tap on the button again, you realize we have the slip, which is a key in the results we are getting. So we could just get the slip like this, like we were doing previously. And now when we tap on the button, we are just getting the ID itself and then the advice. So to have a good structure, this is how it looks like, and we are just taking whatever is in the slip itself, right? Now this data is more like a map. We want to model it into a class that we can use. So just in our project, I'm going to create a file called advice, and this is going to be a simple class that's going to have two fields. So the first one is going to be the ID, and the second one is going to be a string that will be called text, right? And let's have a constructor for this class, and I want to have a named version of the constructor. So we call this, and now back in our home page, after we've gotten the data, we know that the data will have an ID and then an advice field on it, right? So we want to set this particular data to a variable that we will create and display in the UI. So the first thing for us to do is to have some variable that will be used for setting this data. Now the reason why we are doing this is because we don't want to use a feature builder. We want to manage our loading state ourselves, right? So you get to know of this as we progress. So the first thing to do is to create a variable called and it's not going to be fine now, so advice, and call it initial advice, which is going to be our advice, and then the ID is going to be 0. And now we can copy our initial advice over here, right? So let's copy this and then use it as the text, right? So we have this initial advice, and now when it comes to the text, we can do initial advice dot text, and also when it comes to the ID displayed over here, So in the text, we can have our pound symbol, and then we are going to have our initial advice.id like this. So that is going to give us this, right? And now after we are done fetching this data, we want to set our initial advice to whatever we had, right? So that's how we are going to change the initial advice. So we want to set state, and then our initial advice is going to be an advice, right? Because it has to always be an advice. And then the ID is going to be data accessing the ID field, and then the text is going to be data accessing the advice field. So if we look at the results we'll be getting, our ID is going to be an integer, and our advice is going to be the string we want to show. Okay, so doing something like this will set our initial advice to this advice coming from the response. So if our response is not 200, it means something went wrong. So else, what we want to do is we want to set state again. This time around, we don't have the data, so our ID is going to be 0, and then our text is going to be sorry, we couldn't fetch the advice, right? So that is what's going to happen. And if an error occurs, we just want to do the same thing. So in the catch block, you can copy and then paste the exact same thing. And now let's tap on the button to see. So realize that when we tap on the button, our state gets set, and then we see our text changing, right? Now we don't have any loading state to see if we are loading or not, because if we are fetching for the advice, it may take some time before the advice gets put on the screen. So that time must show the user some loading indicator. So in order to do that, let's just have a boolean somewhere here called loading, and initially set to false. So when we try fetching, right, when the person taps on the button, we want to set state and then set loading to true. Now after we've gotten our data, we want to set loading, so loading to be false, and then if anything happens to you, want to set loading to false, right? So all of these places we want to set loading to false. Now in our button, we don't want to fetch advice all the time. When we are loading, we want to disable the button. Then we can have loading. So if loading, we want to set the onPress to now, else we want to set the onPress to the fetch advice, right, like this. So this will handle the enable and disable of the button. Now with the icon, when we are loading, we want to change the icon to a loading indicator. So just like we did for the onPress, if we are loading, we want to have a circular progress indicator dot adaptive, else our icon, right? And let me add my const everywhere. And if we are loading again, we want to change the text within the text widget. So if we are loading, we want to have loading, else we want to have whatever we copied, so this, and I also remove the const, right? So let's try that out, and then realize we get our loading states like this. And during the time it's loading, you won't be able to click on the button, right? Yeah, so this is all about the advice generator app. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.